They fired her for not fitting their image, told her she wasn't doctor material, made her invisible in her own hospital. But they didn't know who she really was. They didn't know what she was capable of when everything was on the line. On one rain-soaked Tuesday night, when an 8-year-old boy lay dying and every renowned physician in Chicago General had given up hope, the woman they dismissed would perform a miracle that would change everything. This is the story of Dr. Maya Richardson, and the moment the world finally saw her. What would you do if they told you that your best wasn't good enough simply because of how you looked? Dr. Maya Richardson stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her natural hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the exhaustion etched around her dark eyes. At 34, she moved through Chicago General's emergency department like a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged by colleagues who seemed to look right through her. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to make herself small, to take up less space, to speak only when absolutely necessary. Her scrubs hung loose on her petite frame, practical shoes silent against the polished floors as she navigated between patient rooms with the efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of being unnoticed. In her locker, tucked behind her spare scrubs and personal belongings, sat a faded photograph from her medical school graduation. In it, a younger Maya beamed with pride, her parents flanking her on either side, their faces glowing with the kind of joy that comes from watching dreams become reality. Her father, a janitor who worked double shifts at 3 different buildings to pay for her education, had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Her mother, a nurse at the community clinic who inspired Maya's calling to medicine, wore her Sunday best dress, the one she saved for church and special occasions. "Our daughter, the doctor," her mother had whispered that day, as if speaking too loudly might make it all disappear like smoke. But that Maya felt like a different person now, a stranger from another lifetime. 3 years of being overlooked for promotions, of having her diagnoses questioned more harshly than her white colleagues, of being told she needed to work on her bedside manner when she was nothing but gentle with patients, had worn her down to something she barely recognized. She had stopped speaking up in meetings, her voice growing smaller with each passing month. She had stopped volunteering for complex cases, no longer raising her hand when challenging opportunities arose. She had learned to be grateful for the shifts they gave her, even when they were the worst ones that no one else wanted, the night shifts and holiday rotations that came with the most difficult patients and the least support. The only thing that remained from her hopeful younger self was her stethoscope, engraved with the words, "Dr. Maya Richardson, Maryland," in elegant script, a gift from her parents on her very first day of residency. She wore it like armor, a tangible reminder of who she was supposed to be, even when everyone else seemed to have forgotten. Sometimes, during the quiet moments between patients, she would run her fingers over the engraving, feeling the raised letters that spelled out her identity, her worth, her years of sacrifice and study. It was the only thing in this place that acknowledged her as more than just background noise, more than just a diversity hire who had somehow slipped through the cracks. Maya's apartment reflected the same careful invisibility she maintained at work. Small, modest, furnished with pieces from thrift stores and hand-me-downs from relatives. The walls were bare except for her medical school diploma, hanging in the hallway where visitors might not notice it right away. She had learned to make herself comfortable in spaces that didn't quite fit, to find peace in the margins where expectations were lower and disappointment was less likely to find her. Her neighbors knew her only as the quiet woman in apartment 2B, who worked odd hours and never made noise, never complained, never drew attention to herself in any way that might be considered troublesome. Maya hadn't always been invisible. Before Chicago General, before the 3 years of being overlooked and undervalued, she had been something else entirely, something that felt like a lifetime ago. At Johns Hopkins, during her residency, she had been a star that burned bright in the constellation of promising young physicians. Her residency supervisor, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, had called her the most naturally gifted diagnostician I've seen in 20 years of teaching medicine. Maya had been the resident that other residents came to when they were stuck on difficult cases, the one who could see patterns that others missed, who could piece together seemingly unrelated symptoms like a detective solving the most complex of mysteries. She had been confident then, bold even, unafraid to challenge senior physicians when she believed they were missing something important. She remembered with crystal clarity the night she diagnosed a rare autoimmune condition that had stumped the entire cardiology department for weeks. The patient, a 40-year-old construction worker named James, had been bounced between specialists like a pinball, each one ruling out their particular area of expertise before passing him along to the next. Maya had spent one sleepless evening reviewing his charts, cross-referencing symptoms with obscure journal articles, questioning every assumption that had been made about his case. When she presented her findings to the attending physician the next morning, there had been skepticism written across every face in the room. "Richardson, that's a 1 in a million diagnosis. Are you absolutely certain, doctor?" Harrison had asked, his eyebrows raised in the particular way that suggested he thought she was reaching too far, grasping at medical straws. But Maya had been sure, more sure than she had ever been about anything in her life. The test she requested confirmed her suspicions, and James walked out of the hospital 2 weeks later, his life saved by targeted treatment that would never have been considered without her insight. The cardiology department had gathered around her that day, congratulating her on what they called exceptional clinical thinking and the kind of intuition that can't be taught. That version of Maya had believed she could change the world, one patient at a time. She had dreams that stretched beyond individual cases, visions of running her own department one day, of mentoring young doctors who looked like her, of being the kind of physician who made a real difference in the lives of underserved communities. She had been recruited by several top hospitals across the country, but Chicago General had made her an offer she couldn't refuse. They talked about diversity initiatives with genuine enthusiasm, about needing more physicians who looked like their patient population, who understood the struggles of people who had been marginalized by the medical system. They promised her opportunities for advancement, research funding, the chance to make her mark on a prestigious institution. But the Maya who walked into Chicago General on her first day was not the Maya who emerged after her first year. The transformation had been gradual, insidious, like a slow poison that worked its way through her system until she could barely remember what it felt like to be healthy. It started small, the way these things always do, with comments that could be dismissed as innocent observations, suggestions that her natural hair might be seen as unprofessional by some patients, that she might want to consider a more conservative style, recommendations that she might be more comfortable working in the community clinic rather than the main hospital, where the patients were more diverse and might relate to her better. The breaking point had come during her second year, with a case that should have been her moment of triumph, but instead became the moment she learned to doubt everything she thought she knew about herself. She had been working with a young girl named Sophia, 8 years old, who had been brought in with mysterious seizures that no one could explain. The neurology team was baffled. The pediatric specialists were stumped, and the family was growing more desperate with each passing day. Maya had spent weeks researching, consulting with specialists at other hospitals, refusing to give up even when others suggested they had exhausted all possibilities. She pored over medical journals late into the night, called former professors for advice, approached the case from every conceivable angle. When she finally made the correct diagnosis, a rare metabolic disorder that required immediate intervention, she felt the familiar rush of satisfaction that came with solving an impossible puzzle. But her triumph was short-lived. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, had taken her findings and presented them to the medical board as his own discovery, describing her weeks of research as his innovative thinking and dedication to patient care. Maya had watched from the back of the room as he was praised for his brilliance, as colleagues congratulated him on his exceptional diagnostic skills. When she tried to speak up, to claim credit for her own work, she was told that teamwork was more important than individual recognition. That night, she had gone home to her small apartment and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror for what felt like hours. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, someone who had learned to smile and nod when she should have spoken up, someone who had started to believe that maybe she wasn't as good as she thought she was, that maybe everyone else could see something she couldn't. The photograph from her graduation day sat on her dresser, and she had picked it up with trembling hands, running her fingers over her younger self's confident smile. "What happened to you?" She had whispered to the image, but the photograph offered no answers, only the memory of dreams that felt increasingly impossible to reach. The systematic erosion of Maya's confidence had become an art form at Chicago General, practiced with the precision of surgeons and the subtlety of master manipulators. It happened in 1,000 small ways, each one designed to remind her that she didn't belong, that her presence was tolerated rather than valued, that she should be grateful for whatever scraps of opportunity came her way. And Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief of emergency medicine, had perfected the technique of professional assassination through 1,000 paper cuts, each one small enough to be dismissed as coincidence, but collectively devastating in their impact. It started every morning in the briefings, where Maya would present her overnight cases to the incoming shift with the same thorough professionalism she had learned during her residency. No matter how comprehensive her reports, no matter how successful her treatments had been, no matter how well her patients had responded to her care, Dr. Webb would find something to critique with the persistence of a prosecutor building a case. "Dr. Richardson, did you consider the possibility of acute pancreatitis?" he would ask, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for first-year medical students who didn't understand basic anatomy. When Maya would patiently explain that, yes, she had considered that possibility and ruled it out based on specific lab values and clinical presentation, he would nod with the patronizing smile of a teacher whose student had accidentally stumbled onto the correct answer. The nursing staff, taking their behavioral cues from the attending physicians, like children learning social hierarchies in a playground, had learned to question her orders in ways they never did with her white colleagues. "Doctor, are you absolutely sure you want to start him on that medication?" they would ask, their voices carrying just enough doubt to make nearby patients look up with concern, their confidence in their treatment plan beginning to waver. Maya would confirm her orders with forced patience, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation spread through her chest like acid, knowing that Dr. Patterson or Dr. Williams would never face such scrutiny for identical decisions, never have their competence questioned so openly in front of the very people they were trying to help. But it was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the hospital's star cardiologist and media darling, who had refined the art of professional cruelty to its most elegant and devastating form. During interdisciplinary rounds, she would ask Maya questions that seemed innocuous on the surface, but were loaded with implications that everyone in the room could decode. "Dr. Richardson, I'm curious about your approach to this case. It's quite unique," she would say, the pause before unique, surgical in its precision, long enough to let everyone in the room understand that unique was not a compliment but a diplomatic way of saying wrong. When Maya would explain her reasoning with the same clinical logic she had been trained to use, Dr. Walsh would nod thoughtfully and say, "That's certainly one way to look at it," before proceeding to outline what she called the more conventional approach, the implication being that Maya's methods were somehow experimental, unproven, risky. The medical students were perhaps the cruelest of all, because their discrimination came without the careful polish that senior physicians had learned to apply. They were honest in their prejudice, requesting rotations with the real doctors, as one particularly bold student had put it during what he thought was a private conversation. Maya had overheard 2 residents discussing her qualifications in the break room, their voices carrying through the thin walls with devastating clarity. "I mean, she's probably a diversity hire, right? They had to fill quotas somehow," one had said with the casual cruelty of someone who had never had to fight for his place in the world. The other had laughed, a sound that cut through Maya like a scalpel. "Must be nice to get a job just because of how you look instead of what you know." Maya had stood frozen in the hallway, her lunch tray trembling in her hands, wondering if she should walk into that break room and defend herself, if she should march in there and recite her credentials, her board scores, her publications, her years of training and sacrifice. Instead, she had walked away, as she always did, carrying the weight of their words like stones in her stomach. She had thrown away her lunch, unable to eat, and spent the rest of her shift wondering if everyone saw her the way those residents did, if her colleagues were all secretly questioning whether she deserved to be there, whether she had earned her position through merit, or simply filled a demographic checkbox. The hospital's patient satisfaction surveys had become another weapon in the arsenal deployed against her. Wielded with the precision of someone who understood exactly how to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Comments like, "The doctor didn't seem very knowledgeable and I would have preferred to see someone more experienced," appeared regularly on her evaluations, even when her medical outcomes were excellent, even when her patients had recovered faster than expected under her care. Dr. Webb would call her into his office to discuss these surveys with the grave concern of a father disappointed in his child's report card. "Maya, we need to have a serious conversation about your bedside manner. Patients aren't feeling confident in your care," he would say, sliding the surveys across his mahogany desk with each critical comment highlighted in fluorescent yellow, as if she might miss them otherwise, as if the words weren't already burned into her memory. The administrative staff had learned to schedule her for the worst shifts with the efficiency of people who understood the unspoken hierarchy of the hospital. Weekend nights when the emergency department turned into a war zone, holidays when families were at their most stressed and demanding, the shifts that came with the most difficult patients, and the least support from senior staff. Of Dr. Richardson can handle it, they would say when other physicians complained about their assignments, but Maya knew it wasn't a compliment to her abilities. It was a punishment disguised as confidence, a way to ensure she was too exhausted and overwhelmed to excel, too busy surviving to thrive. Her colleagues had developed a particular talent for making her feel excluded, while maintaining the kind of plausible deniability that would protect them if anyone ever questioned their behavior. They would have important conversations in elevators, stopping mid-sentence when she joined them, as if her presence had somehow changed the security clearance required for their discussion. They would organize group dinners after particularly difficult shifts, extending last-minute invitations to everyone except her, claiming they had forgotten or assumed she wouldn't be interested. When she would arrive at department meetings, the conversations would shift subtly, becoming more formal, more careful, as if her presence had changed the very air in the room from collegial to professional. The final insult had come during the hospital's annual charity gala, an event where the medical staff were expected to attend and mingle with the wealthy donors who kept the institution running. Maya had bought a dress with money she couldn't really afford, had her hair professionally styled for the first time in months, practiced small talk in the mirror of her bathroom until the words felt natural. But when she arrived at the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel, she found herself treated like invisible wallpaper, overlooked by the very people she was supposed to be impressing. Donors would approach her with empty champagne glasses, mistaking her for catering staff, asking her to fetch them drinks or take their coats. When she would introduce herself as Dr. Richardson from the emergency department, they would look confused, as if she were lying about her credentials, as if the idea of her being a physician was somehow impossible to process. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday when Maya sat in her car outside Chicago General, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white against her dark skin. She had just finished another brutal 16-hour shift, another day of being questioned, overlooked, and dismissed, another collection of moments that chipped away at her sense of self, like water eroding stone. The latest humiliation was still fresh in her mind, replaying like a movie she couldn't turn off. Dr. Webb had publicly corrected her in front of a patient's family, overruling her discharge recommendation with the kind of theatrical authority that made everyone in the room understand who was really in charge, only to quietly reinstate her original orders an hour later when the family had left and no one was watching. She pulled out her phone and stared at the resignation letter she had been drafting for weeks, the cursor blinking at her like a patient metronome, waiting for her to make the decision that would end this chapter of her life. 3 years of this. 3 years of being told she wasn't enough, of having her expertise questioned, of being made to feel like an imposter in her own profession, like someone who had accidentally wandered into a world where she didn't belong. She was tired of fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win, tired of proving herself over and over again only to wake up the next day and have to start all over, tired of carrying the weight of other people's expectations and prejudices on her shoulders. Her finger hovered over the send button, trembling slightly from exhaustion and emotion. It would be so easy to just walk away, to find a small clinic somewhere in a different city where she could practice medicine without the politics, without the constant reminder that she didn't fit their image of what a doctor should look like. She could be happy somewhere else, couldn't she? Somewhere where her worth wasn't measured by how well she conformed to their narrow expectations, where her competence wasn't constantly questioned, where she could simply be a doctor instead of a black woman trying to be a doctor in a world that seemed determined to remind her of the difference. But as she sat there in the darkness of the hospital parking lot, her eyes fell on the faded photograph tucked into her sun visor, the one she had moved from her locker to her car months ago, when even that small reminder of her past had become too painful to see every day. It was the picture from her graduation day, the one where her parents looked at her with such pride, such hope, such unshakable faith in her ability to change the world. Her father had worked 2 jobs to pay for her education, picking up extra shifts as a janitor at the university where she studied, mopping the floors of the classrooms where she learned to save lives. Her mother had sacrificed everything to give her this opportunity, working double shifts at the clinic, saving every penny for textbooks and tuition. Our daughter, the doctor, her mother, had whispered that day, and Maya could almost hear her voice now, carried on the wind that rattled her car windows. She thought about the young girl with the mysterious seizures, the one whose life she had saved despite getting no credit for it, despite watching someone else take recognition for her work. She thought about all the patients who needed someone to advocate for them, someone who understood what it felt like to be overlooked and undervalued, someone who knew what it meant to be dismissed before you even had a chance to prove yourself. Maya deleted the resignation letter and put her phone away, her hands steadier now than they had been in months. The ambulance sirens pierced through the typical Tuesday night chaos of Chicago General's emergency department at exactly 11:23 p.m., their urgent wail cutting through the usual soundtrack of beeping monitors and hurried conversations. Maya was halfway through her shift, having already treated a homeless man with pneumonia who had been turned away from 3 other hospitals, a teenager with a broken wrist whose parents spoke only Spanish, and an elderly woman with chest pains who kept apologizing for taking up space in the emergency room. The paramedics burst through the automatic doors with their familiar urgency, but something about the tension in their faces, the way they moved with extra precision, told Maya that this case was different from the routine calls that filled most of their nights. 8-year-old male, pedestrian versus vehicle, multiple trauma, vital signs unstable and deteriorating. The lead paramedic shouted over the controlled chaos, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much but still cared enough to fight for every life. Lost consciousness at the scene. Possible internal bleeding. Blood pressure dropping. Parents are en route from the south side. They wheeled the small body toward Trauma Bay 3, with a kind of urgent efficiency that came from years of practice, and Maya caught a glimpse of the child's face beneath the oxygen mask. He couldn't have been much older than her nephew, his skin pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, his small chest rising and falling with mechanical precision as the ventilator breathed for him. Doctor. Webb took charge immediately, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos with the authority of someone who had run countless codes, who had learned to project calm confidence even when the situation was spiraling out of control. Let's get him stabilized, people. I want a full trauma workup, type and cross for 6 units of blood, get me a chest x-ray and a CT scan of his head and abdomen, and somebody call surgery to let them know we might be coming up. The trauma team swarmed around the boy like a choreographed dance troupe, each person playing their part in the carefully orchestrated attempt to save a life that hung in the balance. Maya stood at the periphery, as she always did, ready to assist but not expected to lead. Her presence acknowledged with the kind of polite nods that said, "We see you, but we don't really need you." She watched as they worked, her trained eye taking in the subtle signs that others might miss, the way the boy's color wasn't quite right, the pattern of his breathing, the particular way his body was positioned that suggested injuries beyond what the initial assessment had revealed. But she stayed quiet, knowing that her voice would be dismissed, that any suggestions she made would be questioned more thoroughly than those coming from her colleagues. The initial assessment painted a grim picture that grew darker with each passing minute. The boy, whose name was Marcus according to the ID bracelet the paramedics had attached, had sustained massive internal injuries that were bleeding faster than they could replace the lost blood. His blood pressure was dropping despite aggressive fluid resuscitation. His oxygen saturation was falling even with maximum support, and the CT scan revealed what they all feared. extensive internal bleeding that would require immediate surgery if he had any chance of survival. But as they prepared to rush him to the operating room, his condition deteriorated with a kind of rapid decline that turned emergency medicine into a race against time. "He's crashing, doctor," Webb announced, his usual composure cracking slightly as the monitors began their ominous symphony of alarms. "Get me epi, now. Start compressions. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine and charge the defibrillator." The flat line of cardiac arrest replaced the irregular but present rhythm they had been fighting to maintain, and Maya watched from her corner as the team worked with desperate efficiency, performing CPR, pushing medications, trying everything in their considerable arsenal to bring the boy back from the edge of death. But something was wrong, and Maya could see it in the way the team was working, in the desperate edge to their movements, in the way nothing they were doing seemed to make any difference. They were missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would explain why Marcus wasn't responding to their efforts, why his body was rejecting every attempt to save him. She stepped closer to the bed, her trained eye taking in details that others might miss, looking for the one thing that could change everything. "Dr. Webb," she said quietly, but her voice was lost in the chaos of the code, drowned out by the urgent voices calling out medications and procedures. She tried again, louder this time, fighting to be heard over the noise. "Doctor, I think there might be—" "Not now, Richardson," he snapped without looking up from the compressions he was performing, his hands pressing rhythmically against the boy's small chest. "We need to get him to surgery. This is a surgical problem now." But Maya had seen something that others had missed. A subtle asymmetry in the boy's neck, a particular positioning of his trachea that could only mean one thing. She had seen it once before, during her residency at Johns Hopkins, in a case that had nearly been missed until the very last moment, when a senior resident had noticed what everyone else had overlooked. "He has a tension pneumothorax," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with sudden authority, the kind of confidence she hadn't used in 3 years. "His left lung is collapsed and the pressure is building. That's why he's not responding to anything we're doing." "Doctor," Webb paused for a moment, his hands still positioned on the boy's chest, and Maya could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "The chest x-ray was clear," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, the first crack in his professional armor. "Not a simple pneumothorax," Maya corrected, moving closer to the bed with purpose, her years of training overriding her learned habit of staying silent. "Tension pneumothorax. The pressure is building up and compressing his heart. Every compression we do is making it worse. We need to decompress it immediately, or we're going to lose him in the next 2 minutes." The room fell silent, except for the continued wail of the monitors, their urgent beeping filling the space like a countdown timer. Everyone was looking at Maya now, this doctor who rarely spoke up, who had spent 3 years being invisible, who was now stepping forward with the kind of confidence that commanded attention. But she wasn't thinking about any of that, wasn't considering the career implications, or the social dynamics, or the risks she was taking. She was thinking about Marcus, about his parents racing through the Chicago streets in the back of a police car, about the photograph on her visor, and the promises she had made to herself about being the doctor her patients needed. "Give me a 14-gauge needle and prep for a chest tube," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins like electricity. "And someone needs to call his parents and tell them we're doing everything we can." Dr. Webb hesitated for a moment that felt like an eternity, and Maya could see the calculation in his eyes, the risk assessment that every doctor learned to make in moments like this. If she was wrong, if she was about to perform an unnecessary procedure on a dying child, it would be her medical license on the line, her career that would be destroyed. But if she was right, if she could save this boy's life, it would be because she had seen what others had missed, because she had the courage to speak up when it mattered most, because she had refused to let another life slip away while she stood silent in the corner. "Do it," he said finally, stepping back from the bed and giving her the space she needed to work. Maya's hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had trained for moments exactly like this, feeling for the anatomical landmarks with her fingers, finding the exact spot where the needle needed to go. She inserted it between the ribs with steady pressure, and immediately there was a rush of air, the telltale hissing sound of a tension pneumothorax being relieved. The monitors changed their tune almost instantly, the flat line giving way to a rhythm that was weak but unmistakably present, the boy's body responding to the release of pressure like a dam finally giving way. "There," she said quietly, her hands still steady as she prepared to insert the chest tube that would keep his lung expanded. "That's what we needed. His pressure should start coming back now." The room erupted in controlled activity again, but now there was hope in the air, a palpable shift in energy that everyone could feel. Marcus's blood pressure began to stabilize for the first time since he had arrived. His oxygen saturation started to climb steadily, and his color began to improve from the frightening gray pallor that had marked him for death. By the time his parents arrived, running through the hospital corridors with tears streaming down their faces, he was stable enough for surgery, and the prognosis had changed from grave to guarded but optimistic. Maya stood in the corner, watching as the boy was wheeled away to the operating room, watching as his parents followed with relief and gratitude written across their faces, knowing that their son would live to see another day, because someone had been brave enough to speak up when it mattered most. She had saved his life, not through luck or chance, but through knowledge, skill, and the courage to trust her own expertise even when everyone else had given up. The trauma bay fell quiet, and Maya became aware that her colleagues were looking at her with something she hadn't seen in 3 years: genuine respect. Maya never sought recognition for what happened that night in Trauma Bay 3. She didn't demand apologies from those who had doubted her, didn't ask for acknowledgement from the colleagues who had spent 3 years making her feel invisible, didn't use the moment to settle scores or prove points about competence and worth. She simply continued to show up for her shifts, to do her job with the same quiet professionalism she had always maintained, to be the doctor she had always been beneath the surface of doubt and discrimination that others had painted over her like layers of unwanted paint. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere at Chicago General, something that couldn't be undone or ignored or explained away. Word of Marcus's case spread through the hospital like wildfire, carried by nurses who had witnessed the save, residents who had heard about the diagnosis, attending physicians who had reviewed the case file with growing amazement. The boy who had been given no chance, who had flatlined on the table while everyone watched helplessly, had not only survived, but thrived in the days that followed. He walked out of the hospital 3 weeks later with barely a scar to show for his ordeal, his laughter echoing through the corridors as he said goodbye to the staff who had become his extended family during his recovery. His parents, Maria and Carlos, a young couple from Chicago's South Side who worked 2 jobs each to make ends meet, had asked specifically to thank the doctor who saved our son's life before they left. When they learned it was Maya, the quiet doctor they had barely noticed during their frantic vigil, they had wept openly in the hospital lobby, holding her hands and telling her she was an angel sent from heaven, that they would never forget what she had done for their family. The moment was captured by another patient's family member, a video that showed Maya still in her scrubs, kneeling down to hug Marcus as his parents looked on with tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. The video spread across the internet within hours of being posted, shared by thousands of people who were moved by the story of the overlooked doctor who had saved a child's life when everyone else had given up. The caption read, "This doctor saved my son's life when everyone else said there was nothing more they could do. Heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like." Comments poured in from medical professionals around the world, from parents who had been in similar situations, from people who recognized the importance of having diverse voices in medicine, of having doctors who understood what it meant to be underestimated and overlooked. Dr. Webb approached Maya in the break room 2 days later, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Richardson," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, lacking the condescending edge that had characterized their interactions for 3 years. That was exceptional work on the Peterson case. Truly exceptional. I wanted you to know that I've recommended you for the chief resident position that's opening up next month." It wasn't an apology for the years of dismissal and discrimination, but it was acknowledgement. And for Maya, it was enough to know that her competence could no longer be questioned or ignored. She thought about her parents, about the little girl she had once been who dreamed of saving lives and changing the world one patient at a time. She thought about all the young doctors who would come after her, who would face the same battles she had fought, who would need to see that it was possible to persist, to excel, to make a difference even when the world seemed determined to make you invisible. She had proven that excellence couldn't be hidden forever, that sometimes the most underestimated person in the room was exactly who you needed when everything was on the line. Maya Richardson had finally found her voice again, had remembered who she was beneath the layers of doubt and discrimination that others had tried to impose on her. And the world, finally, was listening. Some battles are won not with power, but with dignity, not with anger, but with excellence, not with demands for recognition, but with quiet competence that speaks louder than any words ever could. If you were in Maya's position, facing years of being overlooked and undervalued, would you have found the strength to keep fighting? And when your moment came, would you have had the courage to speak up and save a life?